What?
Run.
Oh, that's cool.
Oh. Oh god, not another review. Alright, so to start off, I was actually a fan of this title. Or more specifically, I was a fan of the single player aspect of this game, and only moderately amused by the multiplayer / endgame of this content, which I'm pretty sure they'll have to do a bit more work on, but I'll get to that later. The single player campaign didn't actually revolve around just playing as each Avenger. You end up, for the majority of the game, playing through the eyes of a character known as Kamala Khan. And I wasn't sure if I was going to appreciate her stage presence being the center of attention for the majority of the game. But wow, I was really happy with the way they presented her. Kamala Khan, she starts off at the beginning of the game as this super fan that was lucky enough to be a part of the Avengers Day festival because she had written a fan fiction about the Avengers. So she was able to be a part of this Avengers Day festival. And that beginning of the game was just so enchanting because you're literally playing as a person that's just a super fan, and you just get to experience what an Avengers Day festival would be like. She even gets to have situations where she gets to have some one-on-one time with certain Avengers such as Thor and Captain America. And I really loved that initial presentation of her. I immediately started really liking her. Kamala Khan, as you can tell from the name, she's a Muslim American who ends up becoming the superheroine known as Miss Marvel. And one thing that really stuck out to me that I loved was just the cultural diversity that she brought to the table. I'm not sure if anyone's really noticed, but the Marvel Avengers are all Caucasian, or at least the ones presented in the base game are all Caucasian and majority male, excluding Black Widow. So seeing Kamala Khan, this Muslim American character, join the Avengers, it sort of brought a breath of fresh air to this very generic cast of individuals. And more specifically, I loved her interactions with her father. Her father would always refer to her as Beta, which would be the English equivalent of baby or my darling. And she would always refer to her father, whenever she was speaking to him, as Abu, which in English would translate to father. And even her character's outfit, once she actually does acquire a costume for her heroic persona, it's a burkini. And I loved how she just brought a different type of culture and blended it into this Avengers cast. It just made things so much more interesting. They blended it in such a way where she's this very dorky individual, but she's just herself. I don't really know how to properly explain it. Usually when you have characters that are just super fans, they can come across as a bit annoying to excessive, but with Kamala Khan, she's this super fan that's thrusted into this situation where she has to try to make a difference and try to bring the Avengers back together. And I did not hate it. I did not hate it. She was the right blend of dorky, heroic, funny, charming. I really liked her character. Although, when it comes to Miss Marvel, I loved her character and I loved how she was the focus of the campaign. I personally did not enjoy her gameplay. I understand that she is an Inhuman, but the way she would play, it felt almost as if I was just playing as Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic. And I'm fully aware that the circumstances in which Kamala gained her powers and how Reed Richards gained her powers are very different. Kamala Khan is an Inhuman, and she was not infected, but she was influenced by the Terrigen Project, which made her gain the ability to be a polymorph, whereas Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, was put in a situation in a space-related accident and gained his powers. I would guess you could define him as an enhanced human. Not an inhuman, but an enhanced human. So I understand that the methods of gaining powers are very different, but the way that her gameplay is represented in the Avengers game, she just stretches her arms a lot and she can become bigger. She literally plays just like I would envision Mr. Fantastic would play. So I absolutely loved the character. I loved her presentation, her personality throughout the story. I just was not a fan of how she played because I would much prefer to play as Reed Richards or Mr. Fantastic then. Initial setup of the game and the cultural diversity that the focused character brings really sold me on this game. And I know for a lot of people that's just a small, tiny addition, but for me it was very substantial. certain things that I personally didn't like in the single player campaign. I wasn't that big a fan of Tony Stark, or this version of Tony Stark. I wasn't a fan of how his combat played out. It felt as if you were playing a javelin from the game Anthem. Say what you will about the Anthem game, their method of combat was entertaining, but it just doesn't feel as fun flying around as Iron Man in the Avengers. Also, for some weird reason, Tony Stark, for me personally, was the least charismatic character out of the roster that you could play as. I don't know how they managed to do that, but very few jokes that he would make would land for me. It felt as if his comedic approach was a bit forced, whereas you would have situations where Thor would just speak naturally as if he was a very boastful god, which that's usually his personality, and I would find that hilarious and I'd laugh. But with Tony Stark, it's just whenever he tried making a joke, whenever he tried being sarcastic, it just didn't land with me. So his personality in the story was a bit bland for me. But all in all, the story was surprisingly solid. I even loved the new representation of MODOK. I loved this newer look for him. I was never a fan of how the original MODOK would look with the giant head encased in this little big helmet thing, and you just see tiny arms and legs just dangling. I liked how you see his progression into MODOK throughout the story. But yeah, the story was surprisingly solid. I mean, it wasn't at the same caliber as Spider-Man for the PS4. That game I loved, but it was still really good. So one thing that really didn't sit well with me is the fact that it was a majority single-player campaign with very few peppered in campaign-specific co-op missions. So I just don't understand why they made it mostly single-player with a few co-op missions sprinkled in between the campaign. I thought that was a bit off, considering that this is a game based on camaraderie and teamwork, and you're mainly just, playing by yourself. But no, overall, the story was entertaining for me. It wasn't something that was extraordinary. This was a story that you've seen multiple times in different arcs all over the Marvel Universe. So it wasn't anything insane, but the way they went about it, and my own personal opinion about Kamala Khan really sold me on my enjoyment of the campaign as a whole. That being said, when it comes to the multiplayer, it was not that entertaining. They decided to make Avengers into a loot-based beat-em-up, which is alright, I suppose. The gameplay is a little repetitive, but truth be told, there are plenty of repetitive games that the community plays, such as Destiny, Warframe, The Division 2, Monster Hunter, Borderlands, where the gameplay revolves around loot and repetitive grinding. But the issue with Avengers is that the repetitiveness can get a bit stale after a while. It doesn't have that addictive gameplay factor yet. Obviously, in terms of gameplay, it's very visually exciting, but it's not as in-depth or interesting as some of the other looters that I've played. On top of that, there's a whole leveling up system for each character where they have their own tree branches for their light attacks, their heavy attacks, their ultimate abilities, etc., etc. It's just your standard beat 'em up, and when you reach the end of the game, you're really focused on just leveling up the heroes you want to play as and getting the right types of loot to complement how they fight. Basically, you're making builds, which didn't really appeal to me too much. And then one serious issue when I started playing the multiplayer, I noticed it once or twice when I was playing the single player campaign, but the glitches are absolutely atrocious with the game. I had situations where at the beginning of the single player campaign, I was running on this bridge as the Hulk, and then out of nowhere, as I jump to the next piece of the bridge, I just see a car fly up into the sky, and then my character teleports and just falls into the abyss. I had a situation where I was in the middle of playing a match with my friend, and then out of nowhere, we jumped somewhere, and all of our characters started flying into the sky and then plummeting into the abyss, where we would just see the entire arena above us, but we couldn't do anything because we kept falling and falling and falling for roughly 3 to 5 minutes. There were some ridiculous glitches that they didn't ruin the game for us. We had to reload the checkpoint, we had to restart the whole mission sometimes, but it wasn't anything too irritating. We just found it really funny, and we came across some of these glitches multiple times on PC, so that was another negative. Another thing that I thought was really odd is they have this battle pass system. I see they're trying to make the Avengers game a live service type of game where they're going to keep producing more and more content as the years go by. And they have this weird model where they're treating it as if it's some sort of looter MMO hybrid, which it's not a MMO, it's barely a looter. In fact, I would question calling it a looter because even the loot that you get, it's really lackluster and not entertaining. You'll get some high-end pieces of gear, but they aren't properly represented on your character. Whenever you go into your menu and you look at new pieces of gear, it's just holograms on your character's model. The only things that show are the costumes or the cosmetics that you put on. So gear doesn't have that wow factor. For example, you don't have that wow factor when you finish a raid in Destiny and you got all of the cool armor for your warlock. You don't have that wow factor that you have in Avengers. Everyone looks the same. Yes, your builds will be different, but it's not shown that your character looks different. Everyone's characters will look the same. So that sort of was not good. And some of the co-op missions that you played there, a bit lackluster. Obviously, this is the vanilla base game. I'm assuming they have a plan to enhance the game, provide more content, new enemy types, new side stories. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's already planned DLC for a character named Kate Bishop, who is supposed to be Hawkeye, to my understanding. And there's supposed to be another DLC that pays homage to Chadwick Boseman, played T'Challa, Black Panther. They're planning to make a character for him. So it seems as though it's going to be one of those games where they're planning to make the game better, or at least the end game better, within the coming months to possibly years. I don't particularly know the longevity of a title like this, but with that being said, even with the problems that I had with the multiplayer, with some of the character presentation in the single player, I still really enjoyed the game for what it was. But I really enjoyed the single player. I loved Kamala Khan, which I did not think would happen. Her, the character though, the personality, the fusion of Muslim American culture, that diversity into the roster of the Avengers. I loved it. If I was to give this game a rating, I'd probably have to give it separate ratings. A rating for the single player and a rating for the multiplayer. If I had to give it a rating for the single player, I would give it an 8, but not necessarily because of the story itself, but because of some of the elements that help drive it forward. Kamala Khan, the way she is thrusted into this situation, a super fan trying to bring back the heroes she fell in love with and idolized, trying to bring them back together. Loved it. I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Without a question. Yes, there were certain elements that were not as good, and yes, there's a bit of bias, in my opinion, but I think it was really fun. It was one of those games where I just enjoyed playing it. I wasn't thinking anything was a chore or anything was excessive. When it comes to the multiplayer / endgame, I would give it a 6. My personal experience while playing with my friend, there were way too many glitches. There were certain missions where you could not turn off matchmaking, so we couldn't just play just the two of us. They'd always try to pair us up with random people, which was not our interest. A lot of the enemy types were a bit lackluster. There were some cool ones, but certain enemies were a bit lackluster. Some bosses, they just seemed as though they were powered up versions of smaller enemies. The multiplayer does need quite a bit of work, and I'm sure that's what their plan is to improve the multiplayer more and more within the coming months. But in terms of it being a live service game, I don't imagine this title would have a very long lifespan. It just really depends on how dedicated the Marvel fans are to wanting this game to stay alive. Idealistically, I would love to see a whole new roster of Avengers join this vanilla cast. Maybe 6 more Avengers would be great. Hell, if they even made 20, which I doubt they would, but imagine 20 Avengers just on the menu screen of this game. It would look amazing. But no, all in all, half of me really enjoyed this game and half of me really didn't appreciate the game. So it's really interesting. Again, not here to tell you whether or not you should buy this game or whether or not you shouldn't buy this game. That's completely up to you. If you're a huge fan of the Marvel franchise, you've more than likely already purchased this game, and I don't blame you. I was a huge fan, but all in all, it was good. All right, have a good night, guys. Hey everyone, I really hope you guys enjoyed our not another review of Marvel's Avengers. We really enjoyed playing this game, regardless of some of the issues that were presented. If you liked this review, please be sure to watch some of our other reviews, such as the Mortal Shell review. Join in and listen in to our discussion, A Little Too Late, Let's Talk About It, where we talk about games that We personally haven't gotten a chance to play, but a lot of you out there have. And please be sure to watch our Gamer Positivity online book where we discuss about how video games really helped show us the value that we have in ourselves and how it can be implemented into the real world. And of course, please support us however you can. We're a very new channel and we cannot wait to keep making more content for all of you. Alright, thank you. Good night.